You know that moment? You open your eyes in the morning, outside your window, a new day. You just wanted to spend it peacefully, maybe get a few things done, enjoy a cup of coffee. But suddenly, click, and a fire alarm goes off in your head. And you can't find the off button. One thought latches onto another, each new scenario worse than the previous one. And there it is, that awful feeling that everything is about to collapse. Sound familiar? Now imagine your life isn't a constant battle with your own thoughts. What if anxiety didn't control your decisions? What if you could just live? The paradox is that our brain, designed to protect us, often becomes the biggest obstacle to living a fulfilling life. The worst part? We've become so accustomed to living with anxiety that we consider it normal. But it's not normal. And today, we're going to find out why. Let's start with anatomy. Not just body anatomy, but the anatomy of what happens to us when anxiety takes over. Imagine you're standing in your kitchen, an ordinary Tuesday, 7:30 a.m. You're making breakfast, planning your day. Suddenly, your phone notifies you about an email from your boss. "Hey, we need to talk. Can you stop by my office when you get in?" And here it begins. Your heart races. Your breathing becomes shallow. There's a stone in your stomach. And in your head? Oh, in your head. A real carnival of catastrophes. I'm getting fired. I didn't work hard enough on that project. How will I pay my mortgage? What will my family say? I'll never find another job in this economy. And all this in 15 seconds. 15 seconds to go from an ordinary work email to envisioning yourself homeless. Kierkegaard, the philosopher who devoted much of his work to anxiety, called this the dizziness of freedom. When countless possibilities open before us, we feel not joy, but fear. Fear of making the wrong choice. Fear of the unknown. Fear of fear itself. But what happens from a biological perspective? Our brain, particularly the amygdala, the structure responsible for the fight or flight response, perceives uncertainty as a deadly threat. What helped our ancestors survive when encountering a predator in the forest now activates from an email or a social media notification. Robert Sapolsky, a neurobiologist who has studied stress for decades, says our bodies are perfectly adapted for short-term stress, but catastrophically suffer from chronic stress. Our physiology hasn't changed in the last 200,000 years, but our environment has, radically. The system designed to protect us from tigers is now trying to cope with deadlines, mortgages, and social anxieties. And here's the most interesting part. We voluntarily maintain this state. Voluntarily? What are you talking about? Who would voluntarily live in constant anxiety? Think about it. How many times have you caught yourself running negative scenarios through your mind, preparing for the worst? If I imagine everything terrible that could happen, I'll be prepared. Familiar? Psychologists call this phenomenon defensive pessimism. And at first glance, it seems like a reasonable strategy. But there's a problem. Our brain doesn't distinguish between a real threat and one we've imagined. For our brain, any visualization is a rehearsal for reality. Here's a real-life example. Sarah, 34, a successful marketing executive. On the outside, the embodiment of confidence and competence. But every time before an important presentation, she spends a sleepless night imagining forgetting her words, clients exchanging dissatisfied glances, her boss calling her in for a talk after the failure. And you know what happens? The next day, during her presentation, her body behaves as if all this has already happened. She trembles, stutters, can't focus, exactly as she rehearsed all night. Her anxiety became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But why do we continue doing this? Because anxiety gives us an illusion of control. When we worry, we feel like we're preparing, that we're working on the problem. Anxiety becomes a sort of ritual meant to protect us from failure. And this is where we come to the culmination. Anxiety is our form of a drug. It creates a dependency cycle. We worry about a problem. The problem either doesn't happen or we somehow manage. Our brain concludes, "See, anxiety helped. If you hadn't worried, everything would have been worse." We reinforce the belief that anxiety is useful. And the most absurd part, we even take pride in our anxiety. I keep everything under control. I'm always prepared for the worst. I'm responsible, that's why I worry. But let's face the truth. Constant anxiety is not an advantage. It's not a superpower. And it doesn't make you better prepared. In fact, it depletes your cognitive resources so much that you become less capable of solving real problems when they arise. Now for the most interesting part. What if I told you that your anxiety isn't just about external circumstances? What if your deepest fears aren't related to what might happen, but to who you are? Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, that part of our personality we reject, hide, don't acknowledge. And often our greatest anxieties are the fear of confronting this shadow. Here's a real-life example. Alex, 41, a successful entrepreneur. At work, tough, demanding, sometimes even ruthless. At home, a tender father, an attentive husband. But for the past few months, he's been suffering from panic attacks. Everything seems fine, business is growing, family is happy. So what's the problem? During therapy, it turned out that Alex isn't afraid of external failures, but of his own shadow. That part of himself that can be vulnerable, that can make mistakes, that doesn't always have the answers. His anxiety isn't fear of external failure, but fear of an internal split between who he considers himself to be and who he's afraid he might turn out to be. French philosopher Albert Camus wrote, "Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is." Our anxiety often stems from this refusal of our true selves, of our wholeness. And here we come to an important insight. Often, anxiety isn't about the future, but about the past. About those moments when we felt helpless. About experiences that left us with the belief that the world is a dangerous place, and we're not strong enough to survive in it. But enough theory. Let's move to practice. How do we stop worrying and start living? The first step is awareness. You can't change what you don't notice. Start keeping an anxiety journal, but don't just write, "Today I was anxious." Go deeper. What exactly triggered the anxiety? What thoughts came first? What physical sensations accompanied these thoughts? What images appeared in your imagination? What did I do in response to this anxiety? The method is called cognitive restructuring. You learn to observe your thoughts from the side rather than identifying with them. Here's an example. Sarah receives a message from a friend. "We need to talk." Immediately, a cascade of anxious thoughts begins. "She's upset with me. I must have said something wrong. She doesn't want to be friends with me anymore." But when Sarah stops and writes down these thoughts, she notices a pattern. She always expects the worst in relationships. And this isn't related to the specific message, but to her long-standing fear of abandonment that stretches back to childhood. Simply by recognizing this pattern, Sarah can tell herself, "Stop. This is my old anxiety talking. Let's wait and find out what my friend actually wants to say before jumping to conclusions." This technique is particularly effective for those who constantly think through worst-case scenarios. Here's how it works. Take your scariest scenario and ask yourself, what if this actually happens? Give an honest answer, then ask again, and then what? Continue until you reach a logical conclusion. For example, what if I fail this project? I could get fired. And then what? I'd have to look for a new job. And then what? I might be unemployed for a while and have to budget carefully. And then what? I might find a better job, or a worse one. But either way, I'll survive. See what happens? Instead of getting stuck in a loop of catastrophic thoughts, you go through the entire path and realize even the worst-case scenario isn't the end of the world. Most of our fears, when followed to their logical conclusion, turn out not to be so scary after all. This technique also shows that we're capable of handling more than we think. As Marcus Aurelius said, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." We can't underestimate the connection between body and mind. When we're anxious, our body tenses up, but the reverse connection works too. When we relax the body, the mind calms down as well. Here's a simple 5-4-3-2-1 method you can apply in any situation. Left, name 5 things you can see. 4 things you can feel. 3 sounds you can hear. 2 smells you can detect. 1 taste. This exercise instantly brings you back to the present moment, interrupting the cycle of anxious thoughts. It's based on mindfulness principles, the practice of conscious presence, which proves its effectiveness even in clinical studies. Another powerful technique is diaphragmatic breathing. Many of us breathe shallowly, especially in moments of stress. But deep, slow belly breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part responsible for relaxation. Try it right now. Inhale for a count of 4, hold for 2, exhale for 6. Repeat 5 times. Feel the difference? Even a few minutes of such breathing can significantly reduce anxiety levels. Here's the biggest paradox. The more we try to control uncertainty through anxiety, the less control we have. True power comes through accepting that some things are simply not in our hands. The Buddhist tradition offers the practice of radical acceptance, the ability to be with what is without resistance, without trying to change reality. Here's a practical exercise. When you feel anxiety, try telling yourself, right now I'm feeling anxious, and that's okay. I can be with this feeling without trying to push it away. Not, I am an anxious person, but right now I'm feeling anxiety. The difference in wording is critical. The first identifies you with anxiety. The second recognizes that anxiety is a temporary state that comes and goes. Psychologist David Barlow, an anxiety disorder specialist, developed the method of interoceptive exposure, consciously triggering anxiety symptoms in yourself, rapid breathing, dizziness, to learn to accept them. His research shows that when we stop fearing our anxiety, it loses its power over us. Perhaps the most powerful thought that helped me personally is the realization that anxiety isn't living, it's survival mode. When we constantly scan the horizon for threats, we miss the beauty that's already before us. We're so focused on what might go wrong tomorrow that we miss what's going right today. Philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about 2 modes of existence, authentic and inauthentic. In the inauthentic mode, we live automatically, driven by fear and social expectations. In the authentic mode, we consciously choose our life, aware of its finitude. Paradoxically, it's the acceptance of our limited time that can free us from anxiety and allow us to live more fully. Here's an exercise that helps me transition from survival to living. Every morning, I ask myself, if I knew this was my last year, month, or day, how would I spend it? This isn't to provoke anxiety, but on the contrary, to see more clearly what truly matters. Antonio, 53, postponed a trip to Japan his entire life because it wasn't the right time. Other issues needed to be resolved first. What if something happens? Last year, he was diagnosed with a serious illness, and he finally went. You know what he said after returning? I thought the disease was the worst thing that could happen, but now I understand that the worst thing is to live your entire life in fear. The irony is that by trying to avoid pain through anxiety, we often create more suffering than we would experience by simply meeting life as it is. We've come to the end of our conversation, but really, this is just the beginning of a new way of being in this world. Not in a constant state of high alert, but in a state of openness to life with all its unpredictabilities. Anxiety won't disappear completely, and that's okay. It's part of our human nature. But it doesn't have to be the default mode. It shouldn't control your life. Sometimes the bravest act is simply allowing yourself to be. Not perfect, not always prepared, not absolutely certain. Just being human, with all your contradictions, mistakes, and beauty. As Rumi wrote, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. So what's keeping you from that field? What have you never allowed yourself to do? And what's been holding you back? Write in the comments. Perhaps just by naming it, you'll take the first step toward freedom. I believe in you, and in the fact that on the other side of anxiety is a life waiting to be lived, not someday later, Not when everything is ready, but now. Now.